May 7, 1945. Victory in Europe was hours away. Across America, preparations for celebration were underway as the long war in Europe drew to its inevitable conclusion. But in a modest prisoner of war facility outside Colorado Springs, Colorado, something was happening that would challenge everything Americans thought they understood about victory, redemption, and the simple power of human kindness. When camp officials gathered 53 female German prisoners to announce their impending repatriation, they expected relief, perhaps even joy. What they witnessed instead was something unprecedented in the history of American military operations. 22 women, their faces marked by months of internal struggle, stepped forward with an impossible request. They asked to stay in captivity rather than return to freedom in their homeland. These weren't hardened Nazi ideologues or fanatics who had committed atrocities. They were young women who had served as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel for the Wehrmacht. Women who ranged in age from 19 to 32, captured during the final chaotic months of the European War. What could possibly transform enemy prisoners into people who preferred American captivity to German freedom? The answer lay not in grand political gestures or dramatic moments of conversion, but in something far simpler and more profound. It began with butter. Real butter, creamy and golden, spread thick on mashed potatoes that steamed on metal trays in an American mess hall. Before we discover how something as ordinary as butter could change the course of 53 lives, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 6 months earlier, in November of 1944, when the first transport of female German prisoners arrived at Camp Carson. Unlike the larger facilities housing thousands of male POWs across America, this smaller compound had been hastily adapted to house women. The military had little experience with female prisoners of war, and uncertainty hung over every decision about how to manage them. The women who stepped off the transport trucks that cold November morning carried with them more than just the worn remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms. They carried years of propaganda, deeply embedded beliefs about American cruelty and deprivation, and an absolute certainty that they were about to experience the worst treatment imaginable. Among them was 21-year-old Ottilie Bauer, called Tilly by everyone who knew her. A radio operator from Stuttgart, she had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. Now, standing in the Colorado wind with her threadbare coat pulled tight against the mountain chill, she clutched a small leather diary that contained the only remaining fragments of her previous life. She had no idea that within hours, everything she believed about America, about her enemies, and about the war itself would begin to crumble. It would start in the mess hall with a simple plate of food that contradicted every lie she'd ever been told. The 53 women who arrived at Camp Carson that November afternoon represented a cross-section of Germany's female auxiliary services. They had been captured in France and Belgium as German forces retreated, swept up in the chaos of a collapsing front. Some had been taken near field hospitals, others from communication posts that had been overrun before they could evacuate. Their journey to America had been long and disorienting, crossing an ocean to a continent most had only seen in propaganda films designed to make them fear and hate their enemies. Corporal Francine Sullivan stood near the camp entrance as the transport trucks rolled through the gates. At 27, she was one of only 3 female guards assigned to the facility, and she had been given primary responsibility for the initial processing of the prisoners. She watched as the women descended from the trucks, noting their mixture of defiance and fear. They moved stiffly, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes darted nervously, taking in every detail of their new surroundings. Most were thin, some alarmingly so. Their uniforms hung loose on frames that had clearly known months of inadequate nutrition. Herta Schneider was the oldest among them at 31. A trained nurse from Nuremberg, she had served in field hospitals near the front lines for 2 years before her capture. She stepped down from the truck with the careful dignity of someone determined not to show weakness, but Francine noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the small bundle of personal possessions she had been allowed to keep. Behind her came Gertrude Lang, called Trudy, a 23-year-old administrative clerk whose glasses sat crooked on her face, one arm repaired with wire. The processing took most of the afternoon. The women were photographed, documented, and issued new clothing to supplement their worn uniforms. Throughout the procedure, they remained silent, except when directly questioned, responding in clipped German that the camp's translator, a German-American sergeant named Wilhelm Klein, converted to English. But Francine noticed something odd. The women kept glancing toward a building on the far side of the compound, and their expressions held something that looked almost like fear mixed with confusion. It was Sergeant Theodore Jackson who finally explained what they were reacting to. The Mississippi-born cook had been preparing the evening meal, and the smells from the mess hall kitchen had been drifting across the compound all afternoon. The scent of cooking meat, of baking bread, of real food being prepared in quantities that seemed impossible to women who had lived through years of German wartime rationing. Tilly Bauer stood in line during processing, trying to identify the smells that contradicted everything she knew about America. She had been taught that Americans were suffering from food shortages, that their soldiers went hungry while German forces had plenty. Yet the aromas reaching her told a different story entirely, one that made no sense within the framework of everything she believed. Before arriving at Camp Carson, every woman in that compound had spent months or years absorbing a carefully constructed narrative about their American enemies. The propaganda had been thorough, consistent, and repeated until it became indistinguishable from truth. In training facilities across Germany, female auxiliaries had been shown films depicting American poverty and deprivation. They had been told that the United States was a nation on the brink of collapse, its people starving, while their government threw away resources on a war that Germany would inevitably win. Tilly remembered her training in Stuttgart with uncomfortable clarity. The instructors had been convincing, their presentations backed by what appeared to be authentic photographs and statistics. American soldiers, they were told, survived on minimal rations while fighting a war their citizens opposed. The American home front was supposedly characterized by food riots, bread lines, and desperate shortages of every basic necessity. Germany, by contrast, was portrayed as a nation of plenty, blessed with superior organization and resources that would ensure ultimate victory. The women had believed these stories because they had no reason not to. Information in wartime Germany was tightly controlled, and alternative viewpoints simply didn't exist in any accessible form. When Wilhelmine Hoffmann, called Minna, had joined the Auxiliary Corps at 28, she had done so partly from patriotic duty, but also from practical necessity. The Corps offered regular meals at a time when civilian rations were becoming increasingly sparse, but she had been assured that the shortages were temporary, strategic necessities, while Germany redirected its abundant resources toward final victory. What none of them had been told, what they couldn't have known, was that their own experience of growing hunger in Germany was far closer to the truth of the war than any of the propaganda they had consumed. By 1944, German civilian rations had been cut repeatedly. Butter had become a rare luxury. Fresh meat appeared sporadically, if at all. Bread was made from increasingly creative substitutes as grain supplies dwindled. The women had noticed these changes but had attributed them to temporary wartime necessities, not to fundamental resource shortages in their own country. Matilda Weber, called Tilda by her fellow prisoners, had worked in supply coordination before her capture. The 24-year-old had seen the reality behind the propaganda more clearly than most. She had watched requisition requests go unfilled, had seen the creative accounting required to make dwindling supplies appear adequate on paper. But even she had believed that conditions must be worse in America. that the enemy must be suffering even more acutely than Germany's own citizens. Now, standing in an American prison camp and smelling food cooking in quantities she hadn't encountered in years, Tilda felt the first crack appear in the foundation of everything she thought she knew. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. The evening meal was announced at 1800 hours. The women filed into the mess hall with the rigid discipline that came from military training, but their eyes betrayed their confusion and anticipation. The building was warm, heated against the November cold in a way that German facilities had rarely managed in recent years. Long tables with attached benches filled the space, and at the far end, a serving line had been set up where American kitchen staff waited with large serving implements. Tilly moved through the line in a daze, holding her metal tray as instructed. Sergeant Jackson, a tall man with dark skin and gentle eyes, spooned portions onto her tray without comment. Mashed potatoes, fluffy and white, formed a mountain in one section. Green beans, actually green and not the gray-brown of overcooked vegetables, filled another compartment. A piece of roasted chicken, actual meat with crispy skin, took up a third section. And then, as she watched in disbelief, the sergeant added a pat of butter to the top of her mashed potatoes. Real butter, golden and solid, beginning to melt into the hot potatoes. She carried her tray to a table and sat with Herta and Trudy, but she couldn't take her eyes off the butter. It had been 3 years since she had seen real butter. 3 years of ersatz spreads made from coal byproducts and chemicals, of margarine so inferior it barely deserved the name, of bread eaten dry because there was nothing to put on it. The last time she had tasted actual butter had been at her grandmother's house in Stuttgart in 1942, before the shortages became severe, before everything good disappeared from German tables. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions. Some stared at their trays in silence. Others whispered to each other in rapid German, their voices pitched high with confusion and disbelief. A few were already eating, mechanically at first, then with increasing speed as if afraid the food might be taken away. Aloysia Becker called Lois. A 26-year-old signals operator had tears streaming down her face as she ate. Though whether from relief or shame or simple overwhelming emotion, even she couldn't have said. Tilly finally picked up her fork. She scooped a small amount of mashed potatoes, making sure to get some of the melting butter. She lifted it to her mouth and paused for just a moment, some part of her reluctant to cross this threshold. Then she tasted it. The butter was rich and creamy, the potatoes smooth and properly seasoned with salt and pepper. The flavor was so intense after years of bland, inadequate food that it almost hurt. She closed her eyes and felt something break inside her chest, some carefully maintained wall between what she believed and what was real. Over the following days, the women began to understand that the first meal had not been an aberration or a special gesture designed to deceive them. Every meal at Camp Carson followed the same pattern of abundance that contradicted everything they had been taught about American deprivation. Breakfast brought eggs, real eggs with yellow yolks, alongside toast made from actual wheat bread with butter for spreading. Lunch offered sandwiches with generous portions of meat and cheese, accompanied by fresh fruit when available. Dinner continued to feature proteins, vegetables, and starches in quantities that would have fed a German family for a week. Corporal Sullivan had been watching the prisoners carefully, noting their reactions to the food with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She had been briefed on German propaganda claims about American shortages, and she understood intellectually that these women had believed they were coming to a land of deprivation. But seeing their actual shock at normal American military rations gave her a new perspective on just how thoroughly they had been deceived. She mentioned her observations to Sergeant Jackson one afternoon as he prepared the evening meal. The cook paused in his work, considering her words. He had grown up poor in rural Mississippi during the Depression, and he understood hunger in a way that many of his fellow soldiers did not. He had seen the way the German women ate, the speed and desperation in their movements, the way they cleaned their plates completely and looked almost guilty about asking for seconds. It reminded him of his own childhood, of times when his family hadn't known where the next meal would come from. These women, he realized, had been living with that uncertainty for years, even before their capture. Tilly had taken to lingering near the mess hall between meals, drawn by curiosity about the source of such abundance. Through the kitchen windows, she could observe the American staff at work, and what she saw continued to undermine her understanding of the war. Sacks of potatoes were stacked along one wall, dozens of them, more potatoes than she had seen in one place since before the war. Crates of canned goods lined shelves from floor to ceiling. A large refrigeration unit, miraculously functioning despite what she had been told about American infrastructure collapse, held quantities of milk, butter, and fresh vegetables. Sergeant Jackson noticed her watching, and, after checking with Corporal Sullivan, invited her inside to see the kitchen properly. Through halting English and Wilhelm Klein's translation, he explained the American military supply system. Food came from farms across the country, he told her, transported by a logistics network that had actually grown more efficient during the war rather than collapsing, as German propaganda claimed. The abundance she saw was normal, expected, the baseline for feeding American soldiers and, by extension of the Geneva Convention, prisoners in their custody. The realization of how thoroughly they had been deceived created a complex emotional storm within the German prisoners. By their second week at Camp Carson, the women were no longer simply grateful for the food they received. They were struggling with shame, confusion, and a growing anger at the system that had lied to them so completely. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing daily created conversations that grew increasingly heated during their free time in the barracks. Herta found herself at the center of many of these discussions. As the oldest prisoner and a medical professional, the other women looked to her for guidance in processing their conflicting emotions. She understood their turmoil because she felt it herself every time she sat down to a meal. The food was better than what she had eaten as a free woman in Germany, better than what she had been served while working in field hospitals supposedly supporting victorious German forces. Every bite reminded her that she had been part of a massive deception. Some women, like Minna, initially tried to rationalize the contradiction. Perhaps this particular camp was unusual, she suggested. Perhaps the Americans were feeding them well as part of some psychological operation designed to weaken their resolve. But this explanation grew harder to maintain as days became weeks and the food never diminished in quality or quantity. The abundance wasn't a trick or a temporary display. It was simply how Americans fed people, even their enemies. Tilly wrestled with a different aspect of the shame. She had been hungry for so long that the relief of regular, adequate meals felt almost sinfully good. Her body responded to the nutrition with obvious gratitude. She slept better, felt stronger, noticed her hair becoming less brittle and her skin improving. But with each physical improvement came a wave of guilt. Was she betraying Germany by accepting American food? Was she collaborating with the enemy by allowing her body to heal and strengthen in their custody? The shame was compounded by the kindness with which the food was offered. If the Americans had been cruel, if they had mocked the prisoners' hunger, or made them beg for meals, it would have been easier to maintain the narrative of American barbarism that had sustained German resistance. But Sergeant Jackson served food with quiet dignity, never commenting on how quickly the women ate or how thoroughly they cleaned their plates. Corporal Sullivan ensured that anyone who was still hungry could request additional portions without judgment or interrogation. Trudy tried to refuse seconds one evening, her guilt overwhelming. Her hunger. She sat at the table with her cleaned plate, visibly struggling with herself as other women returned to the serving line. Lois, sitting across from her, finally spoke what many were thinking. "We were lied to," she said quietly in German. "Everything they told us about America was a lie. Refusing to eat won't change that. It will only mean we suffer for no reason, just as we suffered in Germany for no reason." The words hung in the air, uncomfortable but undeniable, a truth that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. By late November, the prisoners were permitted to write letters home, subject to military censorship. The announcement brought a mixture of relief and anxiety to the barracks. Most of the women had not been in contact with their families since their capture, some for even longer. The prospect of finally communicating with loved ones in Germany should have been joyful, but instead it created a new dilemma that kept many women awake at night, wrestling with impossible choices about truth and silence. Tilly sat at a wooden table in the common room with a single sheet of paper before her, a pencil in her hand, and absolutely no idea what to write. How could she tell her mother and sister in Stuttgart about her life in captivity without mentioning the food? But if she did mention the food, how could she possibly make them understand without sounding insane or seeming to have been brainwashed by American propaganda? The abundance she experienced daily at Camp Carson was so far beyond anything available in Germany that describing it accurately would make her letters sound like fantasy. She started several times, each attempt ending with the paper crumpled and discarded. "Dear Mother," she wrote, "I am safe and well treated. We receive adequate food." But adequate was a lie. "Dear Mother, I am safe. The Americans feed us butter and fresh meat daily." But that sounded like mockery when she knew her family was surviving on rations that had been cut repeatedly. There was no way to describe her reality without either lying or causing pain to people she loved who were suffering while she, a prisoner, ate better than she had in years. Herta faced a similar struggle. She wanted to tell her sister in Nuremberg about the medical supplies she had access to in the camp infirmary, about the abundance of bandages and antiseptics and medicines that had been desperately scarce in the field hospitals where she had worked. But how could she write such things when she knew civilian hospitals in Germany were operating with almost nothing? Her sister was a teacher, not a medical professional, but everyone in Germany knew about the shortages. Describing American abundance felt like betrayal. Around the room, other women grappled with the same impossible task. Some chose to write brief, emotionless notes that revealed almost nothing about their daily lives. "I am alive, I am unharmed. I hope to see you again soon." Others wrote longer letters that carefully avoided any mention of food or living conditions, focusing instead on questions about family members and requests for news from home. A few, like Minna, wrote detailed letters describing everything they were experiencing, knowing the military censors would likely remove most of the content before the letters were sent. Tilly finally settled on a compromise. She wrote a letter that was honest but vague, describing adequate treatment without specifics. But separately, in her leather diary, she began documenting everything in detail. She wrote about the butter, the fresh milk, the quantities of meat and vegetables. She described Sergeant Jackson's kitchen and Corporal Sullivan's kindness. She documented her own shame and confusion. Someday, she told herself, this record might matter. Someday, someone might need to know the truth about what they had experienced, about the lies they had believed and the reality they had discovered. Sergeant Theodore Jackson had been working as a military cook for 3 years, but the German women prisoners at Camp Carson were unlike any group he had previously served. He noticed things about them that others missed, subtle signs that spoke to someone who had personal experience with real hunger. The way they positioned themselves near the serving line long before mealtimes. The careful attention they paid to portion sizes, their eyes tracking his serving spoon as if calculating exactly how much food they would receive. The complete silence that fell over the mess hall during meals, broken only by the sounds of eating. One evening in early December, he watched as Tilda approached the serving line for the second time, her movements hesitant and uncertain. She had already finished her first serving, but was clearly still hungry. Yet she approached with visible reluctance, as if expecting to be refused or punished for wanting more. Jackson spooned a full second portion onto her plate without comment, adding an extra pat of butter, and gestured for her to take additional bread if she wished. The look of surprise and gratitude on her face troubled him deeply. He mentioned the incident to Corporal Sullivan during cleanup. "These women eat like people who've been starving for years, not months," he observed. Sullivan nodded, sharing her own observations about the prisoners' physical condition when they arrived. Most had been underweight, some dangerously so. Their hair had been dull and brittle, their skin showing signs of vitamin deficiencies. The transformation over just a few weeks of adequate nutrition had been remarkable, but also revealing about the deprivation they had endured. Jackson began making subtle changes to his meal preparations. He increased portion sizes slightly, knowing the women needed more calories to recover from extended malnutrition. He made sure there was always extra food available for anyone who wanted seconds or thirds. He began baking bread daily, knowing that fresh bread with butter seemed to affect the prisoners particularly deeply. The aroma of baking bread, he noticed, brought women to the mess hall windows even between meal times, drawn by a smell that apparently held powerful associations with better times in their lives. His own childhood in Depression-era Mississippi informed his understanding. He remembered his mother's creativity in feeding 7 children on almost nothing, the way hunger had been a constant presence in their household during the worst years. He remembered the shame of being hungry, the way it diminished a person's sense of dignity and worth. He recognized that same shame in the German women's eyes, and he was determined that no one would feel ashamed about needing food while under his care. Tilly began to understand that Sergeant Jackson's generosity was intentional, not accidental. She observed how he served food, noting that he gave slightly larger portions to women who appeared particularly thin or weak. She saw how he positioned extra bread near the end of the serving line, where women could take additional pieces without having to ask. Most tellingly, she noticed that he never showed surprise or judgment when prisoners returned for second or third servings, treating their hunger as completely normal and acceptable. December arrived with heavy snow that transformed Camp Carson into a landscape both beautiful and alien to the German prisoners. Most had never experienced mountain winters, and the dramatic Colorado weather became another reminder of how far from home they truly were. But the approaching Christmas holiday created an atmosphere of complicated emotions throughout the compound. For many prisoners, this would be their first Christmas away from family, their first holiday celebrated in enemy captivity, and no one knew quite how to navigate the strange intersection of tradition, homesickness, and their current circumstances. Corporal Sullivan proposed organizing a modest Christmas celebration for the prisoners, understanding that depression and homesickness could pose serious morale and health problems during the holidays. She cleared the idea with Camp Command, receiving permission to allow the women to create simple decorations and to organize an evening gathering on Christmas Eve. What she didn't tell the prisoners immediately was that Sergeant Jackson had been planning something special for the Christmas meal, something that would prove to be another turning point in their understanding of American intentions. The prisoners approached the holiday preparations with cautious interest. Tilly and several others volunteered to create decorations from available materials, cutting paper stars and chains from old newspapers and magazines. Herta organized a small group to practice German Christmas carols, thinking that music might help ease the homesickness that was becoming increasingly visible in the barracks. The activities provided welcome distraction from the uncertainty about their futures and the guilt many felt about being adequately fed while their families in Germany struggled. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the Colorado sky brilliant with stars visible in the mountain air. The mess hall had been transformed as much as circumstances allowed. The paper decorations hung from rafters and candles borrowed from the camp chapel provided warm light. The women gathered nervously, unsure what to expect from an American Christmas celebration. Some wore their best remaining clothes, attempting to mark the occasion with whatever dignity they could muster given their limited resources. Then Sergeant Jackson and his kitchen staff began bringing out the Christmas meal, and the prisoners fell into stunned silence. The dinner exceeded anything they had experienced in their weeks at the camp. Roasted turkey, golden brown and steaming, emerged from the kitchen on large platters. Sweet potatoes, topped with what appeared to be marshmallows, created a dish none of the German women had ever seen before. Fresh rolls, still warm, were piled in baskets. Cranberry sauce, green beans with almonds, and mashed potatoes with gravy filled serving bowls. And for dessert, Sergeant Jackson had somehow managed to acquire the ingredients for pumpkin pie, explaining through Wilhelm Klein that this was a traditional American holiday dish. The abundance was overwhelming. Lois began crying quietly before the meal even began, overwhelmed by the generosity being shown to them as prisoners on a holiday that should have been reserved for celebration among families and friends. Minna stared at the turkey as if unable to believe it was real. Even Herta, who had maintained careful emotional control since their arrival, felt her composure crack at the sight of such abundance being offered to enemy prisoners on what should have been the Americans' own special celebration. The Christmas celebration marked a subtle but significant shift in the relationship between prisoners and their American captors. In the days following the holiday, conversations became more frequent and more personal. The barrier of mutual suspicion that had characterized the first weeks of captivity had been weakened by the generosity shown during what should have been the Americans' own special celebration. Women who had previously kept their distance from the guards began initiating conversations, asking questions, attempting to understand the people who had shown them such unexpected kindness. Corporal Francine Sullivan found herself becoming an informal confidant to several of the prisoners, particularly those whose English was improving rapidly. One afternoon in early January, she was making her rounds through the compound when she encountered Herta sitting alone in the common room, staring at a letter she had received from Germany. The older woman's face showed signs of recent tears, and Sullivan hesitated before approaching, unsure whether her presence would be welcome or intrusive in what appeared to be a private moment of grief. Herta looked up and, after a moment's hesitation, gestured for Sullivan to join her. The two women sat in silence for a few moments before Herta began to speak in careful, accented English. "My sister writes from Nuremberg," she said quietly. "She tells me they have no butter since 1942. No real butter for 3 years." She paused, struggling with both the language and the emotion. "She tells me their Christmas dinner was turnip soup and a small piece of bread. This was all they had for Christmas." Sullivan listened without interrupting as Herta continued, the words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. "I have not told her what we eat here. How can I tell her? She will think I am lying, or that I have become mad, or worse, she will think I am collaborating with the enemy because I am grateful for food that should not exist if everything we were told about America was true." Herta's hands twisted the letter, creasing the thin paper. "I was a nurse, Corporal Sullivan. I saw wounded soldiers with no morphine for their pain because we had none. I saw men die from infections because we had no antibiotics, and I believe this was necessary sacrifice for victory." The confession seemed to exhaust something in Herta. She looked at Sullivan with an expression that combined shame, anger, and desperate confusion. "Why do you feed us so well?" she asked. "We are your enemies. We served the country that started this war. Why do you give us butter when my sister has none? Why do your prisoners eat better than my family?" Sullivan considered her response carefully, understanding that this moment required honesty rather than diplomatic platitudes. "Because feeding people properly is the right thing to do, regardless of who they are or what country they come from," she said finally. "And because we have enough to share. America isn't perfect, but we do have enough food. We always have." Herta absorbed this quietly, then asked the question that had been haunting her since her arrival. "Everything they told us about America was a lie, wasn't it? Everything about your country collapsing, about your people starving, about your soldiers having nothing." "It was all lies." Sullivan nodded. "Yes, it was all lies." Herta closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing a physical blow, then opened them with an expression of grim determination. "Then what else was a lie? What else did they tell us that wasn't true?" By February of 1945, the physical transformation of the German prisoners had become impossible to ignore. The women who had arrived at Camp Carson in November, looking gaunt and unhealthy, had gained weight, their faces filling out, their complexions improving, their energy levels rising noticeably. The camp physician, Captain Robert Morrison, documented the changes in his monthly reports with a mixture of professional satisfaction and troubled awareness of what these improvements revealed about the prisoners' previous conditions. Captain Morrison conducted routine health examinations of all prisoners, and his findings painted a clear picture of systematic malnutrition followed by recovery. On average, the women had gained between 10 and 15 pounds since their arrival, bringing most of them closer to healthy weights for their heights and ages. But more significantly, blood tests showed improvements in markers that indicated they had been suffering from vitamin deficiencies and protein malnutrition before their capture. Their bodies were responding to adequate nutrition with dramatic healing that suggested they had been operating in a state of deprivation for extended periods, possibly years. The women themselves noticed the changes with complicated feelings. Tilly found that her uniform, which had hung loosely on her frame when she arrived, now fit properly. Her hair, which had been brittle and dull, had regained some of its natural thickness and shine. She could see in her reflection that her face had lost the hollow, angular quality that had characterized her appearance during her final months in Germany. She should have felt pleased about looking healthier, but instead, she felt a persistent guilt that intensified with each physical improvement. Trudy articulated what many were thinking during a conversation in the barracks one evening. "We are healthier as prisoners than we were as free women serving our own country," she said quietly. "What does that say about everything we believed? What does it say about the government we served?" The question hung in the cold air of the barracks, unanswerable but demanding acknowledgement. The women's improved health was living proof of the deception that had governed their lives in Germany, evidence written on their own bodies that they could not deny or rationalize away. Minna had begun keeping careful notes about the changes she observed in herself and others, a habit born from her administrative training. She documented weight gains, improvements in skin and hair quality, increased energy levels, and even changes in emotional states. Many women who had been depressed and listless upon arrival were now more active and engaged. Sleep quality had improved across the board. Minor health complaints that had plagued women for months or years had resolved themselves with proper nutrition. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But the improvement in their physical condition created a new source of shame and confusion. Letters from Germany continued to describe worsening conditions, increasing hunger, and desperate circumstances. The contrast between the prisoners' improving health and their families' deteriorating situations became a source of profound moral distress. Some women, like Lois, began eating less despite their hunger, attempting to somehow express solidarity with suffering families through self-imposed deprivation. Others, like Herta, argued that refusing adequate nutrition was pointless, martyrdom that helped no one and only perpetuated the lies they had finally begun to see through. The mail call in late February brought a particularly large delivery of letters from Germany, and the atmosphere in the barracks that evening was heavy with grief and guilt. The letters painted a picture of a country in collapse, of cities reduced to rubble, of families scattered or destroyed, and most persistently, of hunger that had become the defining reality of civilian life in Germany. The women read their letters in silence, each absorbing news that made their own circumstances feel increasingly surreal and wrong. Tilly received a letter from her sister in Stuttgart that she read 3 times, trying to comprehend words that seemed impossible. Her sister described how their mother had given her own food portions to the children, how she had grown weak and thin from sacrificing her meals. The family's ration cards provided barely enough to survive, and even those meager allotments were often unavailable because supply chains had broken down completely. Her sister wrote about neighbors who had died from starvation-related illnesses, about children with swollen bellies and blank eyes, about the desperate search for anything edible. Across the barracks, similar scenes were unfolding as women absorbed news from their families. Minna learned that her brother had been killed in the final months of fighting and that her elderly parents were living in a bombed-out building with no heat and almost no food. Gertrude's family in Munich had been reduced to eating soup made from grass and whatever they could scavenge. Lois discovered that her younger sister had died from pneumonia complicated by malnutrition, her body too weak to fight off illness. The contrast between their family's suffering and their own relative comfort became unbearable. That evening, several women refused dinner entirely, unable to face eating when they knew their loved ones were starving. Others ate mechanically, each bite accompanied by waves of guilt that made the food taste like ash. Herta watched her fellow prisoners struggle with this impossible moral equation and understood that they were facing a crisis that went beyond simple hunger or survival. Corporal Sullivan noticed the change immediately. The mess hall, usually filled with quiet conversation during meals, had become silent except for the sounds of reluctant eating. Women who had been gaining weight and health now pushed food around their plates, their expressions haunted. Some were crying openly. The letters had stripped away any remaining psychological distance between their experience as prisoners and the reality their families faced in Germany. That night, Tilly wrote in her diary with shaking hands, "I ate roasted chicken and mashed potatoes with butter while my mother starves herself to feed her grandchildren. I sleep in a warm bed while my family huddles in ruins without heat. I am a prisoner who lives better than free Germans. How can this be right? How can this be justice?" She paused, then added words that captured what many prisoners were feeling. "We were told America was our enemy, but America feeds us while Germany starves its own people. Who then is the real enemy?" The crisis triggered by the letters from Germany led to intense debates among the prisoners about their moral obligations and the meaning of their situation. In the evenings, groups gathered in the barracks to discuss questions that had no easy answers. Should they refuse to eat in solidarity with their starving families? Should they be grateful for adequate food or ashamed of having it while Germans suffered? Did accepting American generosity constitute betrayal of their country, or was it simply survival? Tilly found herself at the center of many of these discussions, her intelligence and thoughtfulness making her a natural voice in the debates. She argued that refusing to eat accomplished nothing except making themselves suffer pointlessly. Their hunger in Colorado would not feed families in Germany. Their declining health would not improve conditions in Stuttgart or Munich or Berlin. Martyrdom through self-starvation was emotional theater that served no practical purpose and helped no one. But Lois disagreed vehemently. "How can we sit here eating butter and meat while our families starve?" she demanded during one heated evening discussion. "Every bite feels like betrayal. Every meal reminds me that I am alive and comfortable while my sister is dead from hunger. If we accept this food without protest, without some gesture of solidarity, are we not saying that American comfort matters more than German suffering?" Herta listened to both sides before offering her own perspective as a nurse who had seen the consequences of malnutrition up close. "I understand wanting to refuse food as a gesture of solidarity," she said carefully. "But I have watched people die from starvation and its complications. It is a terrible death, slow and painful. Choosing that death when you have access to food does not honor those who had no choice. It wastes the life you still have." The debate continued for hours, with different women articulating different positions based on their own experiences and values. Some argued that they should eat and maintain their health precisely because they might eventually return to Germany, where they could help with reconstruction. Others felt that accepting American generosity while Germans starved was a form of collaboration that stained their honor. A few suggested that their situation was so morally complicated that there were no clear right answers, only choices that each woman had to make for herself. Minna proposed a different approach entirely. Instead of refusing to eat or accepting food with guilt, she suggested they should bear witness to what they were experiencing. They should document the truth about American abundance and German lies. They should preserve evidence that might someday help other Germans understand how thoroughly they had been deceived. Suffering through unnecessary hunger would not accomplish this, but surviving to tell the truth might. Tilly found this argument compelling and said so. "We were lied to about everything," she said. "The least we can do is preserve the truth for those who come after us. If we die from refusing food, we take that truth with us. If we survive, we can testify to what we learned." The discussion ended without full consensus, but most women agreed that purposeful starvation served no one's interests. A few days after the intense debates in the barracks, Tilly approached Sergeant Jackson during kitchen cleanup, hoping to understand the perspective of the man whose generosity had become the focal point of so much prisoner guilt and confusion. Through a mixture of her improving English and Wilhelm Klein's translation assistance, she asked him directly why he fed them so well when their own families in Germany were starving. Did he not feel that they deserved to suffer as their families suffered? Sergeant Jackson paused in his work, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. He gestured for Tilly to sit at one of the mess hall tables, and he joined her, his large hands folded on the scarred wooden surface. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of personal experience that gave his words authority beyond his rank. "I grew up poor," he began. "Real poor. Not just wartime shortages, but depression, poverty where we didn't know if we'd eat from one day to the next." He described his childhood in rural Mississippi, the constant hunger that had been his companion through his early years, the shame that came with being the kid whose stomach growled in school, whose clothes were too thin for winter, whose family was known throughout the county as people who had nothing. His mother, he explained, had performed miracles of creativity to feed 7 children on almost nothing. She had foraged for wild greens, trapped small animals, traded labor for food, and somehow kept her children alive through years when many families lost members to starvation and disease. "And through all of that," he said, "she taught us that hungry people deserve to eat, regardless of who they were or why they were hungry. Hunger isn't something people earn or deserve. It's just suffering, and easing suffering when you can is what decent people do." He looked at Tilly directly, his dark eyes serious. "You ask me if you deserve to suffer because your families are suffering back in Germany. I say suffering isn't something anyone deserves, and adding your suffering to theirs doesn't reduce the total amount of suffering in the world. It just means more people are hurting." He paused. "I can't feed your families in Germany. I wish I could, but I can't. What I can do is feed you right here, right now, and that's what I'm going to keep doing." Tilly felt tears welling up, moved by the simple moral clarity of his position. "But we are your enemies," she said quietly. "We served Germany. We were part of the war against America." Jackson shrugged. "You're people who need food, and I have food to give. That's all that matters in my kitchen. Whatever happened before you got here, whatever you did or didn't do in the war, none of that changes the fact that you're hungry and I can feed you." His philosophy was simple but profound, and it cut through all the complicated moral debates that had consumed the prisoners for days. May 8, 1945 arrived with the news that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe was official. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was finally over, and across America, celebrations erupted in streets and town squares. But at Camp Carson, the announcement brought not celebration, but profound uncertainty about what would happen next to the 53 German women who had spent the past 6 months in American captivity, learning truths that had shattered their understanding of the world. Corporal Sullivan gathered the prisoners to inform them officially of Germany's surrender, expecting reactions that might range from relief to despair. What she saw instead was a complicated mixture of emotions that reflected how thoroughly these women's relationship to their homeland had been transformed. Some cried, mourning the defeat of their country and the deaths of so many German soldiers and civilians. Others seemed almost numb, as if the news was simply confirming what they had already known must come. A few appeared relieved that the fighting was finally over, but underlying all their reactions was a question that no one wanted to voice directly: what would happen to them now? In the days following the surrender announcement, rumors spread through the compound about repatriation procedures being developed for German prisoners of war. Male POWs in camps across America were being prepared for return to their defeated homeland. The women assumed they would face the same fate, and the prospect filled many of them with dread that they struggled to articulate even to each other. Tilly tried to imagine returning to Stuttgart, to a city she knew from letters had been heavily bombed, to a family struggling with starvation and homelessness, to a country that bore no resemblance to the Germany she had left. She tried to imagine explaining where she had been, what she had eaten, how American captivity had been characterized not by cruelty but by generosity. Would her family believe her? Would they think she had been brainwashed or had collaborated with the enemy? How could she bridge the gap between her experience and theirs? Herta faced different concerns. At 31, she was old enough to remember Weimar Germany and the chaos that had preceded the Nazi rise to power. She feared that Germany's defeat might bring similar turmoil, with food shortages, political instability, and social breakdown creating conditions even worse than wartime deprivation. As a nurse, she knew she would be desperately needed in Germany, but she also knew that German medical facilities would have nothing: no supplies, no medications, no equipment. Could she return to practicing medicine under such impossible conditions after experiencing American abundance? The women began having quiet conversations about possibilities they barely dared voice aloud. What if they didn't have to return immediately? What if there were alternatives to repatriation? The questions were dangerous, suggesting disloyalty to Germany, but they persisted nonetheless. Whispered in corners of the barracks late at night, when women couldn't sleep for worrying about their futures. The official announcement came on May 15, 1945. Camp Commander Colonel William Patterson called a general assembly of all German prisoners to explain repatriation procedures that had been finalized by the War Department. The 53 women gathered in the mess hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what this moment would mean for their futures. Many had been unable to sleep the previous night, knowing that decisions made in the coming days would determine the entire trajectory of their remaining lives. Colonel Patterson stood before them with official documents, his expression serious but not unkind. He explained through Wilhelm Klein's translation that transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to their homes or to whatever remained of their homes in occupied Germany. He assured them they would be treated fairly throughout the process and that the International Red Cross would assist in locating family members for those who had lost contact. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Tilly stood slowly, her legs shaking, but her voice steady when she spoke in careful English. "Colonel Patterson, may I speak for some of us?" The colonel, surprised but willing to hear her out, granted permission. Tilly looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing, seeing in their faces the same desperation and hope she felt. "Some of us have been discussing our situation," she said, "and we wish to ask if there might be alternatives to immediate repatriation." The words fell into the assembled room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and confusion. Several American guards exchanged surprised glances. The colonel himself appeared momentarily speechless. Tilly pressed forward before her courage failed her. "We understand this is unusual, but we have reasons for this request. Many of us have no families to return to. Some have lost everyone in the bombing. Others have not heard from their families in years and don't know if anyone is alive. Herta stood next, adding her voice to Tilly's. Colonel, we have learned things here that have changed how we understand the world. We were lied to about America, about the war, about everything. Going back to Germany means returning to a country that no longer reflects what we thought we were serving. It means returning to starvation after months of adequate food. It means facing suspicion and shame for having been captured and supposedly corrupted by enemy influence. More women stood, creating a group of 22 within the larger assembly. They had discussed this moment endlessly in the barracks, debating whether to make this unprecedented request, knowing it might be refused but unable to face repatriation without at least trying for an alternative. Minna spoke next, her voice quiet but clear. Here we have found something we never expected. Dignity, even as enemies. Kindness where we anticipated cruelty. The chance to work and contribute and become better people than we were. The implications of their request were staggering. Legally, they were enemy prisoners of war, subject to Geneva Convention requirements for repatriation. But their emotional appeal touched something deeper than legal procedures, something that spoke to fundamental questions about redemption, second chances, and America's responsibility toward those who had been deceived by their own government. The weeks following the unprecedented request were filled with tension, bureaucratic debates, and soul-searching among prisoners and American personnel alike. Colonel Patterson had forwarded the request to military command with his own cautiously supportive recommendation, noting the unusual circumstances and the genuine transformation he had witnessed in many of the prisoners. The response from Washington took 10 days to arrive, during which the women lived in a state of suspended animation, unable to plan for futures that remained completely uncertain. The War Department's decision, when it finally came, was characteristically bureaucratic but unexpectedly flexible. They would not prevent the immediate repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return to Germany. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. This classification would allow them to apply for sponsors and potentially for immigration status, though it also meant they would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at the military facility. The announcement divided the women who had originally expressed interest in staying. The reality of becoming displaced persons in America, of needing to find civilian sponsors, employment, and housing in communities that might not welcome former enemy nationals, was more daunting than simply remaining in the familiar structure of the camp. After much agonizing discussion and debate, 9 women chose to accept the challenge of seeking new lives in America. 13 decided the uncertainty was too great and opted for repatriation, despite knowing the hardships they would face in Germany. The 31 women who had never wavered in their desire to return home prepared for departure with mixed feelings. They had been transformed by their time at Camp Carson, had learned truths about American society that contradicted everything they had been taught, and had experienced kindness from people they had been trained to hate. Several, led by Trudy, announced that they intended to return to Germany not as defeated prisoners, but as carriers of the reconciliation they had experienced in America. Finding sponsors for the 9 women who chose to stay proved easier than anyone had expected. Local families and organizations, moved by the women's story and their obvious sincerity, stepped forward to offer support. A Worcester family offered to sponsor Tilly, providing housing while she sought employment as a translator. The local hospital arranged for Herta to continue her medical training under supervision, with plans to help her obtain American nursing certification. Other sponsors emerged from church groups and community organizations that saw the women's integration as an opportunity to demonstrate American values of second chances and redemption. The final day at Camp Carson arrived on June 20th. The 31 women choosing repatriation stood in formation, but their military bearing had softened over the months. They carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried a different understanding of what America represented, a truth that contradicted years of propaganda and that they were determined to share with other Germans. 25 years later, in 1970, Ottilie Bauer Henderson stood in a university lecture hall in Denver, Colorado, invited to speak about her experiences as a German prisoner of war and her subsequent life as an American immigrant. Now 46 years old, an American citizen with grown children and a successful career as a translator for the State Department, she carried with her the same small leather diary she had clutched when she first arrived at Camp Carson in 1944. Her story had become more than personal history. It had become a testament to the power of simple human kindness to overcome hatred and transform lives. She began her lecture by describing that first meal in the mess hall, the moment when she had seen real butter melting into mashed potatoes and had felt the foundations of her worldview begin to crack. The butter was just butter, she told the audience of students and faculty members, but it represented something far larger. It was proof that everything we had been told about American deprivation was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had we been lied to about? That single pat of butter started a process of questioning that eventually led me to understand that I had been serving a government built on deception. She spoke about the transformation that adequate food had brought, not just physically, but psychologically and morally. When you are hungry, truly hungry over extended time, it narrows your world, she explained. You cannot think clearly about politics or morality or justice when your body is consuming itself. The Americans didn't just feed us, they gave us back the mental clarity to recognize that we had been deceived. They created the conditions in which we could acknowledge uncomfortable truths about our own country. Herta, now Dr. Herta Schneider, had returned to Germany in 1965 as part of a medical exchange program and had been stunned by the transformation she found. The country had been rebuilt not just physically, but morally, with a commitment to human rights and democratic values that represented a complete rejection of the Nazi ideology. She often said that her experience in American captivity had prepared her to appreciate Germany's transformation because she had undergone her own complete transformation and knew such change was possible. Tilly described the choices the women had faced in 1945, the division between those who chose to stay and those who chose to return. Both groups, she emphasized, had made valid decisions based on their own circumstances and values. The women who returned to Germany had played crucial roles in rebuilding their country and in fostering German-American friendship. Those who stayed had become living examples of America's capacity for forgiveness and its willingness to offer second chances to those who embraced its values. She concluded her lecture by holding up that small leather diary, its pages yellowed with age but its contents preserved. In these pages, I documented everything: the butter, the fresh milk, the kindness of Sergeant Jackson and Corporal Sullivan, my confusion, my shame, my gradual understanding that enemies could become friends. She paused, looking out at the young faces before her. The remarkable thing about America is not that it is perfect, because it isn't. The remarkable thing is that it gave me the freedom to discover truth, to change my mind, to become someone different than who I was trained to be. That freedom began with butter and mashed potatoes, with the simple act of feeding hungry people adequately, regardless of who they were or what they had done.